In this episode, I am joined by Piers Cross, ex-Buddhist monk, coach, and creator of the documentary Boarding on Insanity. Piers explains the British boarding school system, examines its history and social context, and reveals how and why boarding school attendance is seen by many as a pathway to power. Piers recalls his own boarding school experience, the trauma and subsequent breakdown it caused, and describes the dynamic of the privilege double bind. Piers recounts his years as a Buddhist monk, how he navigated suicide attempts and self-harm with meditation and community support, and the powerful mystical experiences he encountered during his religious practice. Piers also lists over 24 leading figures in the arts, business, and politics who attended boarding school, and reflects on the possibility of a leadership class affected by abandonment and dissociation from such elite educational institutions. So without further ado, Piers Cross. Piers Cross, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'm so pleased to be talking with you today. Wow, what an amazing life story you have, an amazing life path you've walked, and a body of work that's come from that, which is really quite fascinating indeed, and I hope to get into all of that. So perhaps we could begin with your early life, the context of your upbringing. At the age of 11 till the age of 18, you were sent to boarding school, and that has become a very defining episode, both in your life and subsequent work. But what about before that? What was the context of your early life? It's not just anybody who goes to boarding school.
No, thank you. Thank you, Steve. So I grew up in a military family, and it was naval. So family, basically senior officers. My godfather was an admiral, and my father was a lieutenant commander. He got very sick. He was an ex-boarder himself, and he got very sick through alcoholism and was invalided out of the Navy when I was 5. So he spent a year in and out of the hospital, basically, with cirrhosis of the liver, which, as a medical doctor pointed out to me in my 20s, he says, a liver is approximately, a foot across. And he says, when you've got cirrhosis, you've got about an inch cubed left alive of your liver. So just the amount of alcohol my father would have had to have drunk. And he was a mess officer, so meaning that he was in charge of alcohol drinking, and it was basically frowned upon if he didn't have a drink every day at the bar, keeping spirits up, etc. So my early life was, when my father wasn't around, was good, but when he was back, it was pretty challenging. I used to fight with him quite a bit. I'd run away. I was angry, like him, basically, and I had quite a short temper. So I think that was my early years. I was very good at sports. I was a very strong person. My father was very strong and sporty. So that was my one release, really, was sports, getting out. We lived in Portsmouth, so getting to the sea, swimming. And I think then the opportunity when I was 10 came up, because my father had not been well, was to go off to boarding school. And certainly in the 70s and 80s, and well, it's still happening now. I mean, Wicked, that new film which is out, essentially that's a boarding school. They say it's a university, but the age of the people who are in this institution, they're probably 16, 17, 18. So it is a boarding school. There's no parents there. And so I was looking at Enid Blyton. I was the boys' own annuals and thinking, it's going to be great to go to boarding school. It was like we're being sold, a bit like Harry Potter. This is going to be amazing. And so I asked to go, age 10. But I think what I didn't understand, and what most people who ask to go to boarding school, they don't understand the impact of it. So then aged 11, I begin at boarding school. I've just turned 11. And first 3 weeks, I really enjoyed it. It was great. Just being away from my dad. But then suddenly, it was like realizing what I had actually given up. And I think this is one thing people don't understand about boarding school, is that you don't just lose your parents, you lose your privacy, you lose comfortable food, you lose your toys, you lose your hobbies, you lose the family around you, your friends. So it is, as Joy Chavarin says in her book Boarding School Syndrome, it's a bereavement. It's not homesickness. When we're mourning and saying I'm homesick, no, that's bereavement, she says. And unless it's dealt with, that's a trauma, that lives on in our psyches. So yeah, that's my early childhood.
I wonder if you might offer a bit of context, social context for boarding schools around the time you went. Because, of course, people from outside of the UK, and maybe some in the UK, the main impression of boarding school one gets is things like Harry Potter, Hogwarts, that sort of thing. And, Blyton, maybe, etc. And I think it might be a little lost on viewers outside of the UK how this whole boarding school thing fits into the social structure of the UK. How does that work? What's that got to do with where you come from? What's it got to do with the pathway that you can follow afterwards, etc.? It's not just wizards and sorting hats. So, no. So I wonder if you might set a bit of the scene more broadly in terms of social context, particularly around when you went, but ranging further if you wish.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So begin really, the history was it's about 597 first boarding school is set up, and that's really to support the church. They wanted choristers and they needed somewhere for these children to stay. So they created these boarding schools. That lasted for a number of years, and then it was about 1370s. William of Wykeham set up Winchester, which is where Rishi Sunak went. Although he didn't board there, he was a day pupil there. And that was, again, originally for the poor, to give them an education. But what happened was the poor started to go to these schools, and they had direct links with Oxford and Cambridge. And so the wealthy who were supporting these schools, they said, well, we want our children. So they changed the mandates rather than it just being for poor. It became basically for the wealthy. And so it became for the elites in the main. So you've got the Eatons, the Harrows, the Winchester, the Radleys, the public schools. There was about 8 to 10, which they talked about in the Clarendon report in about 1870. But then you've also got it was around 700 boarding schools. Now today is about 500. So you have the elite, but then you also have people who are abroad. Maybe they are working abroad, or they're in a ministry, or perhaps they are, you know, business people, and they will send their children to boarding schools. Yeah, essentially, it is almost certainly the elite establishments. It's a way to get to power. You know the right people. I think it's 20 ex-Etonians have been Prime Minister of the UK. And some of the figures that Robert Vercake talks about in his book, Posh Boys, is that from my school, we had about 4 or 5 on my year who went to Oxbridge, Cambridge or Oxford. Do you know what the average is from a state school of getting into Oxford and Cambridge? It's changed a bit now, but this was a few years ago. It's 1 in 2,000. So for me, it's about 1 in 20 from a public school, but from a secondary school, it's 1 in 2,000, which Robert Vercake points out is the same odds as Bono becoming Pope. So you realize that, they are geared for, the wealthy, these schools, and therefore you can often get into a position of power. And one of the things I'm doing with my work is creating a database just to see how many people in positions of authority globally have been to boarding school and are now like Mark Zuckerberg. He's an ex-boarder. Donald Trump, he's an ex-boarder. Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Richard Branson. These people are in positions of power. And, what I'm really fascinated by is if it's a trauma, well, what's the impact on the rest of us? How is their decision making affected by this? So, yeah, that's that. Does that answer the broader context of why these schools are set up?
Yes, it begins to. What is the big deal about Oxbridge anyway? To those outside of the UK, maybe even some in the UK, may not quite understand why that's such a significant thing, this 1 in 20 versus 1 in 2,000 statistic.
Yeah, so basically, Oxbridge is considered the pinnacle. If you get to Oxford or Cambridge, it's considered that you are set for life. Especially so many of our politicians or people working in the BBC have this degree called PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics. I think David Cameron had that. I don't think Boris did, but many, had that degree and they go into politics. So it's a bit like, if you're based in the US, it's like Harvard. If you go to Harvard and someone sees you've got Harvard on your CV, it's like, right, it's possible to get a job anywhere. It opens just doors. And the same with going to an Eton or a Harrow. It just opens doors for you.
And something that maybe is a little different to Harvard is the way in which the institution of boarding schools or public schools, private schools, whatever term we use, and something like Oxbridge is this idea of a class system, or at least a network. Sometimes in the old days called an old boys network. There's some kind of a network effect tied into British class systems in a sense. Is that still the case, do you think? And how might you explain that to somebody from outside of the UK?
Yeah, so an old boys network, I was part of one, because I left my boarding school, when I went to travel in Australia and I connected to the old boys network to see if I could find work. Then when I came back to the UK and I was looking for a job, I contacted them again, and I got interviews at some of the top banks in the world because of my contacts. So it's a bit like it's not what you know, but it's who you know. When I eventually got a job, the person who was interviewing looked at the school I'd been to and go, "Oh, I know that school. Right. You must be of a high standard." And I got the job because of that. And yeah, so essentially the old boys network is, certainly is very supportive of each other. So, on an attachment level, what happens in these institutions is you break the attachment with your parents, age 7. David Cameron went age 7, Boris went 11, with your parents, and you attach to the school. And therefore, they become your attachment figure. Therefore, you'll do anything to defend it, meaning you'll cover up things. Because that was one of the unwritten rules. George Orwell talked about that, is you do not grass up in these institutions. I mean, there was rife sexual abuse in my school. No one spoke up. I was sexually abused in the school. I didn't speak up because it was like, well, who's going to listen? No one would believe me. And it was also, it's like, well, you don't grass up. That was just it's something unwritten. So I think yeah, it's kind of, it's almost like, yeah, does that make sense?
Yes. So there are actual old boys networks. Old boys, not meaning an old chum or something, but meaning a previous boy, which is what they call the students at one of these schools.
Mm, mm,
That's to disambiguate the term.
yeah.
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 Um, in the UK, this might date the interview a bit, but there's been those schools were VAT exempt. The fees were VAT exempt, and that's been withdrawn. And it's kind of a big discussion point at the moment in the UK, in the news. about that. And one of the things that people are saying is that this sort of thing might prohibit people who can just about get their children into such a school by saving and working hard. They themselves perhaps didn't go, but there's a sense in which, in other words, that people wish to put their children, if possible, into a place like that. And of course, everyone knows, perhaps not everyone knows, but people know, I think, that these can be rough places psychologically, but still there's an impulse to put one's child there, partly for access to the network, for a pathway to a higher social band, but also I think there's a sense that the education's better, that they will be better equipped, better nurtured intellectually, and their potential will be recognized, cultivated, and they'll be able to go further, rather than being washed in a sort of sea of a state school, huge class, invisible. So what do you think of that impulse, and what would you say to the education at these places? Does it tend to be better? Is that a fair stereotype?
No, I would say it's not as good, personally. I think there's a few aspects. I mean, one of my friends, he sent his children to boarding school. He'd been himself, and he was saying that his gardener, his children got better A-level results than his children, and he'd spent up to £1 million in fees over the 7 years that he'd sent them to these schools. Obviously, that's a one-off example, but I think that one of the things about these schools is there's a lot of fear. I found I was, very good at sport, so I wasn't bullied, but I was just in fear all the time that, I'm not good enough, something wrong with me. And when we're in fear, as Bessel van der Kolk, the psychiatrist, points out, there's very little activity in the brain. You need to be in a relaxed, safe space. And I agree that the state system is pretty terrible. But you get to go home at the end of the day. You get to go out of the school, whereas you don't have that in these institutions. You become institutionalized. So, I think the facilities are great. Are wonderful. We had sports centre. We had a £5 million sports centre at mine, state of the art. But what we didn't get was care. What we didn't get was love. And they've had some scientific studies recently showing that actually intellect, what exam results you get, are less important to how well you do in your career compared to your emotional intelligence. Which makes sense. If you're emotionally intelligent, you'll be able to relate to people, you're able to have empathy, you can lead people, whereas what these institutions don't have is love, and they don't have emotional intelligence. And as the research shows by Antonio Damasio, professor, he says that you cannot make good decisions without emotional information. The first day at the school for me is you're not allowed to cry. You're not allowed to get angry. If you get angry, everyone shouts at you, psycho, psycho. If you cry, everyone shouts, yeah, you're weak. And because there's no privacy, even today in the schools at Eton, yes, you have separate rooms, but most boarding schools, you probably got 4 or 5 people to a room. For me, there was 30 people in the room. No, I had divisions, meaning partitions, but no doors until I was 16. So for the first 5 years, there was no privacy. And therefore you can't get away. You can't escape. And I wasn't being bullied, but there were people who were being bullied. And that's a 24/7 thing. You never get away from it. So, they say in this country, we've normalized boarding school, but actually we haven't. We've idealized it. We say it's amazing, but there is a cost. And as I've spoken to many people making the documentary, the cost is too high. I know quite a few people who've committed suicide on leaving boarding school. I know many who use alcohol and drugs, prostitutes, to deal with their emotional pain that they don't know how to deal with. It's a price which is too high. It's failed relationships. I've worked with people myself who've been through 3, 4 marriages, they can't do relationships. But if you're in a position of leadership, as most of these people are, you have to have an ability to be good at relationships. That's what a leader is. As you manage people, you kind of connect, you have empathy. So yeah, yeah, it's fascinating.
Well, I wonder if we might then return to your boarding school experience. You arrived there and you enjoyed it for the first 3 weeks, and then it sank in that you'd given up an enormous amount. I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about what it was like. What was a typical day for you, and what were some of the challenges that you began to encounter, particularly in that early initial stage of entering the school?
Yeah, great question, Steve. So what happened? I think first 3 weeks, one thing about a boarding school is you mentioned the typical day from 7 o'clock in the morning till 9:30 at night, you are timetabled. You have no time to yourself. And there is a reason for that. Partly that's one of the ways to keeping the kids in line. But the other thing is so that you don't have to feel. If you're always busy moving from here to there, you're always doing stuff. So we get up at 7, then breakfast 7:30. We had 800 to 900 people in one sitting. And this is a key thing for certainly the food issues. Many people have food issues, especially the girls, anorexia, bulimia, because you don't feel safe. Imagine having a meal with family or in your bedroom or having it with 800 other people. So then 8 o'clock we'd come back, we'd have like cubicle inspection. 8:30 might be chapel, 4 or 5 days a week. Then lessons would start about 9:30, 9:10. We'd have 5 lessons, then we'd march into lunch. We had a big 100-piece band, so we'd all march off to lunch. Then we'd have lunch. Afternoons in the summer, we would have a sport, but in the winter we'd have more lessons. No, we'd have lessons straight after lunch in summer, and then we'd have sport in the afternoon. And the other way round in winter. So we'd have lessons in the evening time. So 4:30 type thing. And then in the evening it would be prep, so we'd be studying, we'd have to sit at our desk and do our homework. And then, yeah, we'd have a chance to have a bath, once a week, and then into bed for 9:30. So that was the typical day, 6 days out of 7. Sunday was a bit less, but we had to go to church sometimes once or twice. So for me, getting there, 11, first 3 weeks, I was quite confident. It was quite big for my age, good at sport. But I think that third week, we had a leave day, an exeat. My mother didn't come and pick me up because her car had broken down. So I was left in the school on my own, suddenly without this routine. And it was a bit like Pinocchio being on Pleasure Island, him seeing behind the scenes of, oh my God, they're being turned into donkeys. Suddenly the busyness wasn't there, and it was like this sadness started to well up within me. And I was like, I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go home. And because it was like there's this dreary, it's dark, there's life here. And so obviously I did see my mother for a couple of hours. I managed the head housemaster dropped me off. But when I got back, I felt very down. I'd kind of was quite deflated. And a couple of days later, I was in my cubicle and I was crying. And one person said to another, "Oh, Piers, he's crying." And I changed my name at that point to stop myself getting bullied. So I changed my name to Simon and eventually the nickname Ziggy. And they all piled into my my cubicle, and they were all shouting at me, going, "Oh, he's not so tough now. He's not so cool." And I vowed to myself then, I will never cry again in front of them. So I learned, so one of the techniques I learned was, Pete Walker in his work of complex PTSD, he says, you bring in the inner critic, because it was so much better for me to be beaten up by my inner critic than the 30 boys in the dormitory. So I started to regulate. Any emotion start to rise up, it was like, you effing piece of crap, just like really being hard on myself. And so that became my way, is to learn to hate myself, because it was so much better to hate myself than have them hate me. Some people who really struggle at boarding school is they don't learn that quick enough. And so they have for 3, 4, 5 weeks until they regulate, until they basically dissociate. They split off from that part of themselves, but they will be bullied until they learn. So that was one of the ways. Another way was I learned not to speak. I became very quiet, just watching. And I also became quite passive aggressive, that I'd wear a frown a lot as I got older, that people knew not to mess with me. And I think because they could watch how violent I was on a sports field, and they saw how I tackle someone to the ground, there was that respect. It was like, oh, I don't want to mess with him. So it just kept people just kept away from me. And I just kept to myself. I didn't talk much, like I said. I didn't have many friends. It was just like being really wary. And dissociating from my feelings. So yeah, it was challenging. So that was 13 then. First, I was doing well in sport, but then I injured myself playing sport. I'm 13 in the junior house, but one of the senior boys in the junior house, and I was like hurt my back, couldn't play sport. Got into the senior house, I still couldn't play sports, and I started to go into depression because I'd just sit on my bed, I'd be reading horror novels, but there was one boy who used to console me. He was 3, 4 years older than me, called Rick, and he basically would come up to my bed and sit by me and chat, and I could go and chat with him, but there was no one else to speak to. So, that was a great help. And then one day, when I was 14, so I'd had my back injury for about a year at that point, I decided I'm really depressed. I'll go to see the doctor. And that day, Rick jumped in front of the train and committed suicide, my mentor. And that really devastated me, devastated the whole house. But suddenly that one beacon of light was gone. And so I contemplated trying to commit suicide myself. But I didn't, partly because I thought, well, everyone's just going to say, well, it's because of him. And I'm like, no, I was depressed and hated the place before he committed suicide. And so, yeah. So I went through quite a dark period of time for a number of months after that. And during that time, I was sent to the priest. By the school, they said, right, you need to go and speak to the priest, and he sexually abused me. And so, yeah, I had to find an inner resource that I didn't know I had. It was like, there's no way out. So I went and lived in the woods for a couple of months, really. After lessons, I'd go into the woods and I started to build a den. I used to just sit peacefully, which, partly the spiritual awakening. It's like, oh, there's something else. There's something else here. And I think, that was the thing that really saved me more than anything.
Thank you for sharing that story. I'm curious about the price of that learning. You talked about a learning to cope, a learning to dissociate, and then figuring out some sort of a strategy. For you, a fierce inner critic and being quiet and being fierce, looking fierce and passive aggressive and things like that. you sort of develop a bag of tricks, I suppose, to
Mm.
cope. I'm curious what the price of that is. Something else that maybe not so much these days, one used to hear a bit about these kind of places is, well, it will, and I think this ties back a little bit to models of Spartan education that were valorized at a certain point in the British Empire. And that was fed into, from what I understand, into boarding school ethos.
Mm.
Maybe you could say something about that. But one sometimes says, well, it'll toughen them up.
Mm.
Put them in a place like that. They'll get a good education. They'll get access to a good network. And what you're describing, this learning to cope, as a harmful thing, actually, that costs a lot, especially later on. A traumatizing thing, by some can be seen as a sort of equipping to deal with the rough and tumble of life, especially at the upper levels of industry, society, etc. And that is a view that one hears, and I think it's perhaps also a view that one hears from people defending their experience in places like that. Well, it gave me a lot, actually. You hear that. So I wonder if you might talk a bit about that, what it costs, and anything else in what I said there that you'd like to remark on.
Yeah, there's many avenues to go down. I think maybe begin with just saying, people say, oh, boarding school, it helps you to create resilience. And I say, no, it doesn't. It creates dissociation, and those are two very different things. If you live at home with your family and you are securely attached, meaning that when you've got a struggle, you've got someone to speak to. When you've fallen over, they'll hold you. When, you've split up from your girlfriend, you can go and speak to them. You know you've got a safe space. When you've got that, that creates resilience. What boarding school creates the avoidant attachment, which basically means you keep intimacy at arm's length. You don't do relationships. You say they're not important. And, you basically, yeah, so that's kind of that's what the boarding school creates. I interviewed someone last week about this and just saying that if you come in as secure attachment, then the school will try and make you avoidant. If you become ambivalent, which means you're more anxious, again, they want to make you avoidant because you don't cause problems then. You don't show emotion, you just get on with everything. So that would be where I begin, is say that no, it doesn't create resilience. Resilience is great, but dissociation, it works for the first 10 years after boarding school. Dissociation, you can do that so long, but then your psyche cannot keep squashing, keep denying. That's why Judith Thurman, the psychiatrist who wrote Trauma and Recovery, she says it's in the third and the fourth decade that the trauma starts to surface. It's undealt with trauma. Again, as Peter Levine says, he says the effects of unresolved trauma can be devastating. Not, oh, it's a little bit, it's devastating. And for me, boarding school is a trauma. If you just look into a little bit, people say, well, that's just your story, Piers. And I said, well, actually, I have 50 biographies here on my shelves, and I can just pull down one after the other about their experiences at boarding school. He was sexually abused. He tried to commit suicide, Richard Branson. What else, was beaten because he was dyslexic until he bled. David Cameron here, he lost a stone in weight. And if you know about how much a 7 to 8 year old child weighs, they're only 3.5 to 4 stone. A third of their, a stone in weight is a third to a quarter of their body weight. That is neglect, and I can just bring down so many. Bear Grylls was beaten till his shoulder nearly snapped. You realize that nearly everyone who's been through these institutions has some form of abuse, rape. I mean, John Peel was raped at boarding school. And again, we just don't know about these stories because you have to go into their books to read them. So for me, it's a trauma. And the trauma is not necessarily the beating, it's the neglect. The neglect of not having your parents around. You're upset, or the food's not good enough, or there's no privacy. The NSPCC says that neglect is the ongoing failure to meet the child's basic needs and the most common form of child abuse. And for me, boarding school is neglect. Your parents aren't there for you. You know, in my boarding house, we had one master on duty for 50 boys. Imagine that if you had, as a parent, 50 children. What would happen to them? Most of them would be neglected. You wouldn't have a clue what was happening. And this is what these institutions do. So, yeah, people say it was the making of me because it created this false persona, but there is a price for it. And for me, the price is too high. And the price is what we see as an abstract set of symptoms. And we go, oh, yeah, I struggle, insomnia, common symptom of an ex-boarder, can't sleep. Reading Woodward, what's his name? Clive Woodward, the England manager. For his biography, they interviewed people and they said that most of them, out of 17 people, 15 of them still struggle with sleep now. So insomnia, struggling relationships, I've mentioned, addictions, depression, anxiety. And people who've been to boarding school, many of them have exactly the same things. Workaholism, inability to relax, inauthenticity, struggle with emotions. You put them all together and you're like, oh my God, yeah, that's boarding school syndrome. So maybe I've gone off tangent, but does that answer a bit, Steve?
Yes, certainly. If these are schools for the wealthiest, among others, and the elite, why would they be so horrible? Why would they be so damaging? One would imagine that if you have the money to place your child anywhere, why feed into that system? And I think this also speaks perhaps to something you talk about, this privilege double bind. You began to touch a little bit on that in your previous answer. So damaging, yet at the same time, so coveted. What's going on there?
I mean, we can see this. It's like it's the cover-up in British society, and I think the cover-up begins in these schools with so many of our leaders. They learn to cover up internally. As Jung says, he says the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. When we don't deal with our inner stuff, it's happening. Cover up. Oh, sexual abuse, So I think that this double bind, it's said by society that it's wonderful. We don't listen to the children, really. We're seeing that with the grooming gangs. We're not listening and paying attention to the children. I kind of heard this from a headmaster I interviewed on my podcast, him saying the duty of care is always to the institution. It's never to the person, never to the child. And I see that's, often people who send their child to a boarding school, not always, but they've often been themselves. So if they're not willing to look at their inner baggage by going, I'm not sending my children to boarding school, they're starting to question what went on. They're starting to go, actually, maybe it wasn't such a good thing. I've heard of people who have sent their children to boarding school. They also boarded as they started to explore it. They wanted to repair with their children and their children wouldn't talk to them anymore. Yeah, they just hated them for sending them to school, to boarding school. It's just really complex. I think we've just idealized. We think somehow it's wonderful because you're going to get a great education. You're away from parents. We somehow think that parents are not important. But actually, I see that parents are the most important. We really need, boarding schools are great, say from 16, but not before that age. Say puberty, that's the time you need the most privacy, to explore your own body. then you can't do that if you're in a shared dormitory. There's no privacy. So I think, the double bind, coming back to that, is that the double bind is that if my parents want me to go and I don't like it, the double bind is there must be something wrong with me. As soon as I damn them and say, well, they're bad parents, well, that's the worst thing ever, because suddenly you no longer have your parents because you're not around them anymore. But then you're ostracizing them from yourself. The child doesn't do that. The only way that they can, and I can't remember the name of the syndrome, but it's almost like you've got to put the fault with yourself. So you think, I'm not good enough. I'm a piece of shit. And the amount of ex-boarders I've worked with, I've heard that their inner belief is I'm a piece of shit. We can put the facade on, oh, I'm wonderful, but inside themselves is no, I'm worthless. Why would my parents send me to a place like this? Especially if they've been themselves. What on earth are they thinking? And parents, the children will tell the parents, and often, most times, 90% of the time, they will not listen. They do not take their children out because they're like, oh, you'll get over it. It's good for you. This will be the making of you. But actually it doesn't. It breaks you. Breaks you down from your individual into this, this almost replica of what the school wants you to be.
Another related double bind I've heard you talk to, and I've heard in the wild, so to speak, is this phrase, you're very lucky to be there. This idea, you're very lucky to be there. You know how many people would love to have the opportunity that you have? This is another sort of privileged double bind, the sense of, gosh, and another phrase that I've heard in the wild, and meaning, in conversations and stuff, but also in your work, is it's the best education you can get. It's the best. This is the best. You're very lucky. That sort of thing. And I wonder if you might, that's one of the memes, isn't it? That makes up the script of those sorts of, or can do, these sorts of institutions. I wonder if you might say something a bit about this and how that might interact with the trauma you're describing.
Yeah. So I think it is. It's very confusing. Your experience is it's difficult for most people. I think even Ben Fogle, the journalist, who's on TV, presenter, he talked about his boarding school experience. And I think his wife as well. And she said, oh yeah, I was homesick for the first year. That's a year of grieving. That has an impact on your psyche, which is trauma which needs to be dealt with. But then for them, what they've done is they've sent their children to boarding school. And it's always been the case that over the centuries, everyone said, well, it's much better now. It's much better now. But there's someone, I was at a conference a few months ago, and someone says, a phone does not substitute a parent. Being able to speak to them on a phone, you can't get a hug from a phone. You can't get love and just presence from a phone. Most of these schools, you're only allowed your phone for an hour a day. So you can't talk to them whenever you want. You're on your own most of the time. So I think the luck thing is that it's the external. You look at the buildings. Oh my God, mine was built in 1560. Well, it began in 1560. The actual buildings I was in was the 19th century. It was kind of the late 19th century, earliest 20th century. So you look at it and it looks amazing. The sports fields, they're like 150 acres. It's like, oh my God, it looks incredible. But then it's a bit like we don't see the importance of emotional intelligence, of emotions, of love. Yes, it might be the most benign boarding school ever, and many of them are, but you don't get love. And love is the most important thing. As Kuz and Posner in their work, The Leadership Challenge, says the secret source of great leadership is love. You love what you do, you love the people who work for you. But if you've learned to not be able to love in these institutions, you disassociate from that. So I think that's it. We are told that if you've got the best subjects, you've got the smallest classes, you're lucky to be there. You've got all of these different sports, you're lucky to be there. But a lot of people, one, don't play sports, so they get bullied for not being good. And yes, you might get small classes academically, but you don't get one-to-one care from your parents. You get 1 to 50. So who looks after you? It's the boys. That's where the character building comes from, and it's often cruel. It's often Lord of the Flies. So when they say it's the best education, they're just looking at one or two aspects. Yes, I learned Russian at school. I went for a trip to Russia. Great. But then in my 20s, I took a razor blade and tried to slit my wrists because of what I'd been through. Is that price worth it? One of the boys on the year below me committed suicide. Quite a few from my school have committed suicide. Is that price worth it to get the best education? I've heard stories of there was a lot of a paedophile was working in one of the schools down on the south coast of the UK, and the police said, right, we want to prosecute this guy, and they said to the parents, we want you to give us statements, etc. And they said, no, it's going to affect my child's education. But they said, but this guy is sexually abusing your children. They said, we don't care. It's more important that they get leave this school with their A levels. So it's like the duty of care is to the institution and not to the child. As soon as we flip that around, I think then we see healing, because it's like, is this going to hurt the child? Yes. Don't do it then.
So I wonder if we might progress a little further then in your life. So you've learned to cope. You've dissociated and armored these various tactics of survival and defense and coping, etc. And then presumably you graduate from your school and go on to, well, in the end, quite some success in your 20s, at least from a certain point of view. So I wonder if you might walk us through those next years of your life as you're coming up to graduation and just beyond.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, by the time I left, it was like I was captain of athletics. I was in the first 15 rugby, first 11 football, I was in a rock band. I was seen as a popular boy. It was like, and I left and I went to Australia and I got a job for just 2 months working in a boarding school as a teacher. And it was a bit like jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. Suddenly everyone was calling me sir. And it just made me realize, first of all, that step is people say that, oh, the teachers didn't know what we were doing as children, like the drinking or the, being with girls and all these different things. And actually, when I worked as a teacher, I knew exactly what they were doing. I'd be 50 meters away and I could hear them talking about me, calling me names, or could tell when they were drinking. And I could hear them talking about, certain teachers that they thought were dodgy, and it's the same with us. At my school, it was like we were aware. We used to have nicknames for all the file teachers, and many of them are now in prison or have spent time in prison. They've now been released. So 18, sorry, I went to Australia. I was at that boarding school for 2 months. But I was so glad I only had 2 months there because I hated it. It was really difficult. Partly because I was so immature and I didn't like boarding school. And so then I traveled and I started to take drugs. I'd always been very hard-nosed before that. I'd always been quite a heavy drinker, but started to take marijuana. And yeah, I just started to relax a bit, but I still had a lot of angst inside of me, and I used to have panic attacks from time to time. Then, age 19, I went off to a university, but I went to a business school in France. So I did 2 years at one of the top European business schools, and learnt French, met a French woman. And then after 2 years in France, came back to the UK, did another 2 years there, and graduated with 2 degrees from this French university and this British one. And I went on to work in the city. So I'd worked for places like Citibank, which is a big American bank, and other Fortune 500 companies, mainly as a salesman. But yeah, I just didn't fit in. I was just really depressed. The big city of London, the commuting, and essentially the trauma that I was unresolved within me was starting to bubble up, and I started to think I was going insane. Started to hear voices, I started to see visions. And when I went to see a doctor to ask about it, they laughed at me. And I was like, okay, that was a bad mistake to go and try and see someone about it. And so I started to basically have a breakdown and I left my partner. I'd been in London then at that point about 4 years. Started to have a breakdown and I just said, right, I'm leaving. So I said I'd leave. After 2 weeks I left, but I didn't really think it through. I didn't have anywhere to go to. So for a month or two I sofa surfed from people's friends, you know, flats, houses, and eventually moved out of London. But around that time, I started to attempt suicide, and it was really probably 2002 that I took a razor blade and tried to slit my wrists. So yeah, so I think it was around that time that I came across the book of Nick Duffel, Making of Them, and it was like, oh, it's my boarding school experience. At that point, I dissociated. I'd actually thought it was good. I was still in that illusion. It was like, oh, no, no, it was a good thing. It's made me into who I am. I used to go back to the school because now I could speak French. I'd go back to the French teachers and say, look, I can speak French now. And so it was really interesting. I did that for a little while. Then I started to read Nick's work, and then I eventually arrived at this Buddhist monastery.
Why do you think the doctor laughed at you? What was going on there, or what happened there? What did you say to the doctor? And what sort of visions and voices and so on experiences were you having around that time? And then specifically, how did you end up in the monastery? How did that go?
Yeah, so I think monastery was synchronicity, how I ended up there. I mean, the doctor, he was a locum, so he wasn't actually resident at this practice, but he was the local doctor's practice. And I just called up, I'm feeling depressed. And so I sat down and spoke to him, and he'd obviously had a long day. It was probably 6:30, and he was just looking at his watch as I was speaking. He was just kind of glancing, and he just said, "Oh, I don't have time for this," and just laughed. I'm like, the first time being a very guarded person, I'd never told anyone that I was down and not in a good place. So I think he was just stressed and not a, yeah, overworked, whatever the reason. But I ended up writing a letter to the doctor's surgery and just saying this is unacceptable. You know, um, so that was 2000. 2001, I ended up. So then my father died around that time. That kind of added into all of that, and I was like, well, do I go off traveling? So I went to Africa for a year, and I went for work for an organization called Teaching and Projects Abroad, which was, and I think it still exists, They take volunteers from the UK who pay, say, £3,000, a bit like the Raleigh Trust or something like Raleigh International. Take 18, 19-year-old boys, men and women, and they give them placements working in hospitals with doctors, veterinarian hospitals, teaching abroad. And I was the assistant manager. So I was in charge of, say, 50, 60 students at some point. And it was intense, really. One, I was mentally not that well, you know, but just being somewhere warm every weekend, I'd go off surfing. That really helped me. But I had to take this anti-malarial tablet. It wasn't Lariam, but it was similar. And I was on it for, say, 8 months. And they say often, something like anti-malaria, you really want to be on it a couple of weeks, a month maximum. And I just think that didn't really help either. So I got back from Africa and I was just in a really poor space. I just got these voices going around my head. I couldn't shut them up. I'd see visions. They were more kind of violent images of people, seeing people being hurt or things like that. And it was just like, whoa. It was like my psyche wanted to be processed. I wasn't listening to my dreams and I wasn't listening to what my inner being was saying because I kept squashing, kept squashing, kept squashing. And so, yeah, yeah. So I made a decision. I needed help. I was always helping others, volunteering in Africa or, helping my father, helping my grandfather. And it was like, no, I've got to help myself now. And I made that decision and I started to look for somewhere to go. I went to a retreat center for 3 weeks and it was like, yeah, this is what I need. Just some peace and quiet, time to study, start to go within. There's a place, Sharpham College, around there down in Devon, a centre, a retreat centre connected with that. And yeah, I think one of the things was while I was there, within probably half an hour of being in this retreat centre, I came across two books by ex-pupils of my old school. And they're both very well known. And they wrote about it, but quite, one was I totally had to emotionally repress, there's something wrong with these schools. The other one likened it to being hospitalized, that emotionally hospitalized, that it was really difficult. He couldn't sleep and stuff like that. And so it was suddenly that woke something up in me going, oh my God, maybe I've got an issue here. Maybe there's something about boarding school. And I started to draw and write. And it was like, actually, I hated the place. And I'd just forgotten. I'd squashed it down. And as I started to draw, it's like this rage of what went on. So that was the 3 weeks. And while I was there, I met one of the teachers who was the meditation teacher who came to the retreat center. And I said, I'm struggling. I had a one-to-one session with him. And he says, well, why don't you write to this monastery? So I tried one of them down in the kind of Hampshire way. They were on winter retreat. So he says, oh, try this one. This one's based up in Northumberland. I wrote, they said, yes, we'd, be happy to have you. And so I went up. I went up for 10 days. And at this time, I'd been offered the manager's job of Thailand for this voluntary organization. I would have had my own house, car, a Western wage in a third world country. And I said, well, let me go and do these 10 days and then I'll make a decision. But in those 10 days, I realized that I was a total mess. I was falling apart. And it was like going to Thailand would be the worst thing for me in this mental state. And so, yeah, I ended up staying for 3.5 years in the monastery.
What happened in those 10 days?
Great question, Steve. Just coming home, really. It was like I'd been running all my life, running away from the pain. And so just being around nice, good people. The things I was into was drinking and football. And while those are, they're okay, they were no good for me. I became very violent in the football. I'd go and watch matches, but quite vocal. And the drinking, because of my father, it just didn't help at all. I'd get more depressed or angry. So arriving in the monastery, those first 10 days was like just having peace and quiet, having a clean diet, fasting at midday, going for walks, meeting with the monks, meditating. It was just like, oh, it was like, yeah, just having a safe container. And I do that in the work I do one-to-one with the leaders that I work with now, is that you have a daily practice to create that safe container so your inner work can start to bubble up. There's safety there. And so, yeah, that was the first 10 days was like, and I was just a lay guest. At the beginning, it was only after I'd been there 4 months did I choose to ordain as a novice monk. But those first 4 months, first week, 10 days was amazing. It was like, ah, yeah, really coming home.
That sounds like a positive experience, but then also before you said you recognized that you were a total mess and falling apart. What about that side of it in those 10 days? What was it that gave you that impression?
So I think, I knew that I was a mess, but it was just like I'd been running and I'm a mess, but suddenly not drinking. Been drinking every day for years, and this therefore just not to drink. So my last drink was 13th of February 2002. So it's been nearly 23 years now. So I think that was it. I realized I was a mess, but it was like I didn't have to run anymore. It was like I was being held, I was being fed. I didn't need to worry about how I was gonna earn a living. It was like, oh, I just work each day here and they will cook me food. They'll give me a roof over my head. So I think also starting the precepts as well. So having the eight precepts, not lying, not stealing, not killing, not no sexual misconduct, also no eating after midday. No, we also had the vow of celibacy and no high or raised beds. So that for me gave some safety. I stopped worrying, oh God, I've stolen another thing, or oh, I walked out of that pub with another ashtray or whatever. It was like just letting go of a lot of the worry. So, I mean, for me, those first 4 months, I started to do yoga, I started to do qigong, falun gong, I started to do, walk every day, I started to paint, to draw. It was just like the things I always wanted to do, but I never gave myself that opportunity or that time. So I think I knew I was falling apart, but it felt good. When I took ordination, that's when I knew I wasn't in a good space. That then kicked me up the butt. That's when the shit hit the fan. Suddenly it's like, okay, you've committed now. And I can't exactly remember what the trigger was, but I started to self-harm probably a week or two after I'd ordained. So started off just with knives, cutting myself, punching walls, punching myself, using my nails just to scratch across my skin. I've still got a 2-inch mark on my arm from where I got a watch strap and I just gouged a hole in my arm. Um, so I think the stuff that was unresolved, as Peter Levine says, the effects of unresolved trauma can be devastating. So what happened to me as a child was then starting to come forth, and yeah, it was touch and go for a number of years whether I would survive. But I had amazing support. I had the monastery, I had the abbot was there supporting me. I was working with a Jungian analyst who was quite a well-known author, but a supporter of the monastery, and she gave the sessions at the beginning for free. So I would travel from the monastery in Northumberland up to Scotland. It was a return journey of 7 hours once a week, then to do 3 or 4 hours of therapy while I was there. And yeah, I think after about 18 months of being in the monastery, I then had a physical breakdown. I couldn't get out of bed anymore. So ME, chronic fatigue. But it was like I also stopped beating myself because I no longer had the energy. So it was like, oh yeah, it was like I started to stop. And I think it was after about 2.5 years that the healing started to happen, and I started to cry less. I started to, stop the self-harming. I started to feel like I was coming out the other side. But yeah, it was very much a dark night of the soul. Very, very difficult. Some people say, oh, you're so lucky to go to the monastery. And yes, the first 4 months were amazing, so beautiful. But after that, it was like hell. Um, just wanting to die every day. Hating myself, hurting myself. And but yeah, I felt so fortunate to have the monks there and the community there supporting me.
And what did that support look like? I mean, that is quite a lot happening to you, coming up, coming out, and expressing in these various different ways. Did it spill into your interpersonal relationships as well? And what was the support of the monks? Were they giving you psychological therapy? Was it conceived of in spiritual terms? Was it just their mere constant presence? Could you say a little bit about the interaction with
Yeah,
the Sangha, I suppose, as it would be called?
Sangha, yeah. It was just that, my psychological support was coming from my therapist. I worked with a few, but eventually arrived with this Jungian analyst. I mean, the monks, it was just friendship. We'd chat. I'd show them the pictures. So I'd meet them once a week and I'd show them pictures I'd been drawing. It was just, if I was struggling, then they would be there. Let's go for a walk. It was just that love and that care. And, one of the things you don't get in boarding schools is you don't get presents. Everyone's so busy. You don't have, you know, comes from really the ancient myths, is the importance of being seen, being heard. I wasn't seen and I wasn't heard in this institution at boarding school, whereas in the monastery, suddenly I was. And it was like, it's just like drinking that in. They're listening to me. If I'm struggling, they'll come and sit with me. They'll listen to me. They'll love me. It was just, yeah, it was just, yeah, kindness, really. And I think it never affected my interpersonal relationship because of the boarding school thing. I always directed 100% of the hate and the anger at myself. It kind of been easy for me to, I was wearing white robes to see my fists would be bloodied coming into the meetings. It kind of been easy for them to see me like that, but I never, if I directed it or I'd got angry at other people, that would have been different. But I was still exactly the same as I'd been at boarding school, passive aggressive. You know, I did put my fist through a wall at one point. Broke, I went to A&E 4 times while I was there for different self-inflicted, whether it was opening arteries or breaking my hand by punching a stone. So yeah, yeah. So I think that was it really.
And what about the religious side of it? Monastery is ostensibly a religious house, and in this case, Buddhist. You mentioned the precepts. I think you also mentioned meditation. I have a couple of questions about it, really. How did you relate to that religious side of it? Did you consider yourself to be a Buddhist? Did you ascribe to ideas of Buddhism such as samsara nirvana, becoming enlightened, that sort of thing? Did you take that on? And did you have prior religious inclinations?
Mm. Yeah, thank you. So I didn't have prior, spiritual inclinations apart from that experience in the woods, that time after my friend had died. That for me was a spiritual experience on one level because that regulated my nervous system and it was just gave me that space. And I think the monastery was similar, that it was a spiritual experience. Yeah, so I considered myself Buddhist, and I still do now consider myself Buddhist. I still follow the precepts, the 5 precepts, not the 8 now. I'm not celibate. Um, I think meditation, I struggled because I was mentally unwell. You know, I remember at one point spending a lot of time one retreat. It was silence for a week and spent a lot of time just meditating. And just a huge pit opened up in front of me. And it was like it felt like my brain had been bruised. That's the only word I could say. And I couldn't close my eyes for a few months after that without feeling queasy and unwell. And so I said to the abbot what happened. He says, "Oh, you know, it's come to the meditation, just keep your eyes open and you don't have to then do the second sit." So we'd do half an hour sit, 15-minute chanting, and then half an hour sit. He says you can leave after the first half an hour and chanting. You don't have to sit for the second one. So I would go and work instead. And one of the abbot's books, I transcribed, listened to his talks, and I would transcribe it. So that was part of my work. So I think, yeah, I mean, I used to read the scriptures quite a lot. We do this thing, this moon day um, evening where we would not have an early morning puja, meditation. So I'd stay up till midnight and I'd read different scripts and, the things like the short discourses, the middle length or the long discourses, and I just go through and read them all. So I think from that, I really enjoyed the teachings because it was Theravadan, the tradition. It was the Thai forest tradition. So it was very ascetic. But it wasn't that it didn't promote enlightenment, but it wasn't seen as, it was just, Ajahn Chah used to say is just keep it really simple. It's like meditation. He used to say the difference between samadhi and samatha and vipassana was the difference between potatoes. And he said, the samatha practice, meditation is like potatoes. And then the vipassana is like cooking them. You can't eat raw potatoes and you can't cook potato if you don't have it. So you need to create that one-pointed mindfulness from the samatha practice for then to go into the insight, into the vipassana. So I found a lot of his teachings just to be really beautiful. And there was a few other teachers, Bhante Gunaratana, who has done the Eightfold Path to Happiness. And I would just read through a lot of these. Pema Chodron's When Things Fall Apart, that was by my bed for years because every time I would go into a difficult space, I'd read that and that would really help me. But I think, yeah, one of the times I was in really dark space and it was a sense of I didn't want to go into the past because it was so painful, what was coming up for me about my childhood. And the present moment was so uncomfortable. And then the future, I couldn't think of being alive in a week or two. And I just had a real spiritual experience, a bit like Eckhart Tolle. I suddenly woke up and suddenly I was in that present moment. It only lasted for about 10 minutes. It was like, oh my God, this is bliss. Suddenly dropping the far past, dropping the future, dropping the present, the present worries. And it was like, oh, and just really awakening in that moment. and then boom, back in again. And I had, probably two or three experiences of like that. Another one I had was one morning I woke up and I was a child. It's very difficult to describe it, but I was like 4 years old. I just felt like this little boy. I was like quite joyful, and it was just like really weird. I've not heard other people share it, but I think maybe once I've heard someone share about that. It just lasted for 3 or 4 hours, but it was so bizarre. And what had happened the night before is I'd been really upset and I'd been really tearful, suicidal, and something had broken, and that little part of me came to the fore again. Like that essence that I'd lost in this school, that I'd had to squash and crush and hate. Yeah. But yeah, that's that's some of my journey.
As you're talking there, you mentioned avoidant attachment. And one of the things that I think is characteristic of avoidant attachment is a sense of, can be, they say anyway, is fear of intimacy, actually. And intimacy can be perceived as a threat. On the one hand, one craves it. On the other hand, when it starts to arrive, it can be feel very, very frightening, very threatening, and then hence avoiding, right? Hence pulling back. So here you're in a situation where it seems like the fellowship of the other monks, the friendship, being seen. For an avoidant attachment person, being seen, I think, can be a terrifying prospect. Of course, one desperately craves it, but at the same time, it's terrifying. So, how did that play out in your case? Did you perceive that which you craved as a threat? It seems not, actually. I'm surprised by that. So I'm curious if you might say something about that.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I think you have to understand that this is playing out over 3 years, 3.5 years. I'm giving you a 20-minute synopsis of it, but you know, I think one of the things, avoidance, we keep intimacy at an arm's length. I wasn't hugging. I wasn't living in the same space as them. I had my own room, so I could go and withdraw at any time. So I had that avoidant ability to go for a walk. I don't want to speak to anyone. I was working in the kitchen, so I could be on my own. So I think, and at the beginning, probably the first, I don't know how many months it was. Probably it was possibly 6 months. It might have been less, might have been more. But the abbot used to say, "Come and speak to if you're down," and I wouldn't go. It was like, no, I'm too stubborn. I can do it all my own because that's another of the key traits of an ex-border is that, I'll do it on my own because we had no one else to look out for us. So it all ended up being ourselves. So I carried that trait. So I stayed avoidant, certainly for the first 6 months, possibly longer. And then I got to the point where it's like, okay, I'm gonna go and speak to him. And, so I'd go in maybe once a day, once every few days, and I'd go and chat with him, and he was just there. And because he had had a really rough time as a monk when he was young, he had the compassion to realize what I was going through. And I think because I worked really hard and I was really good at what I did, I was a very high functioning breakdown, and I wouldn't send that out at anyone, although I was brooding presence. I wouldn't hurt anyone or say any bad things to anyone else. And I was always on time. You know, they didn't throw me out. I think if I had not done anything, then they might have said, "No, you just doesn't work here." But I think I was just really fortunate that it was like I was willing to put in a lot of work. So the avoidant thing, yeah, I think I just started to get help, and working with this analyst, we worked a lot with my dreams. And I think that was really key. And this is the work I do with one-to-one, is we've got to go into the unconscious, especially with complex trauma. You've you've got to go into that space. And I did that work with the dreams with this therapist. And because I work really hard, I would send she said, "Right, I want you to write your dreams down." So I started to write my dreams down, but I did it Piers style. So I would write down 2, 3 dreams, and I'd actually wake in the night and I'd spend half an hour writing all of the dreams down. Then I'd send them to her, and she taught me how to analyze them, and the tears started to come. I had not been able to access my tears because I dissociated. Not even when my friend died or my father died, but the tears started to come. And I think often that therefore helped with the avoidant attachment because I was connecting more to my emotions now. I could just grieve and cry. But it did feel very challenging because there were so many tears. And I think that's one of the reasons ex-boarders or anyone who's been through trauma doesn't want to look at it, because it feels like there's a reservoir of unlived emotions. But as Rod Boothwood, who wrote King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, says, is once you start crying, then gradually the level drops until your head's just starting to get above the water and you can breathe again. But for me, though, I had a few years of really strong tears, and the nightmares I had over a period of a few years were horrific. Every worst thing of being murdered, of being killed in all different ways. It was like my psyche was unwinding from all these years of the trauma of being, at school, but also, my early childhood as well. So yeah, does that answer a question about avoidant
Yes,
attachment?
yeah, very interesting. During all this intensity and this, I mean, it sounds like such a deep scouring of the unconscious and processing of the past, especially at the sort of age you were when a lot of these things originally took place. Must have been very intense indeed. Were you confident that you would somehow emerge? One of the things I think that can be operative in a situation like this is that you don't know any other way of being. So,
Mm.
in healing these wounds and unraveling these coping strategies, in a sense, you're unraveling yourself, at least as far as you know up to that point. So, and what lies beyond that can be quite, I think, for some frightening. Is another reason you've mentioned this reservoir of emotion. Another reason is, well, this is the only way I know, so I'm going to make it work somehow or another. But you were willing somehow to go into that, come what may. So how did you relate to that process? Were you confident?
So I think I was willing. I wasn't willing,
Ah,
Steve. I didn't have a choice. It was like, and I think that was my gift, is, I was going to commit suicide. I attempted. And then one of the monks just said to me, "Do you know the Buddhist views on suicide?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, that moment, your worst moment, when you kill yourself, that pain that you're in, that will send you into a hell realm for maybe lifetimes." And I was like, "What? You're joking." So the one way out of all this pain is not going to help me. Oh no, cheers. So suddenly it was like, I've got to fucking find a way. I don't have a choice. And that was the reality, is that I would have committed suicide. I'm sure. It was just so difficult. But it was like I had to find a way now because, well, the suicide, I didn't want to have that pain which was so intense for 5, 10 minutes or an hour or a day to last for lifetimes. It was like, what? I'm not going to do that. So I was like, God, what terrible karma I've had to not be able to take my life. And so I think I had to find a way. And I think this is the thing about initiation, you know, that we don't have as men now. We need it to come back. I love the Mankind Project, which I'm a part of, is we have a rite of passage and it's challenging, but you're guided through that because the other side is gold. You bring, as Joseph Campbell says, you bring the boon, you bring your gold. It's like my work now with the film coming out in the next few months about boarding school, but linking it to our leaders. That's the gold that's come from my journey of my boarding school and my trauma. How do we heal? How do we move from not just being zombies as I was, to being joyful, to being on purpose, to making a difference in the world? And I think it's that rite of passage often, which is, you know, the threshold. It's so difficult, but I had to find the resources that now is like, oh, yeah, I have an inner strength that, you know, I didn't know I could have. It's like when someone is really struggling mentally, it's like, oh yeah, yeah, I've been through that. And I can have empathy because I've been into that darkness. I think there's a phrase while I was in the monastery, a rabbi, one of the monks was quoting rabbi just saying, we cannot reach the heights of God without scraping our face against the gravel pit of life. And my face has been so thoroughly dragged along that gravel pit for years. So, yeah.
Why did you leave the monastery? What was your state of mind and a state of being at that time, and what did you do next?
Yeah, so why did I leave? The abbot said to me, so each year I would renew. And, you know, I'd do a year. So I'd say I'd commit for a year. So June 2002, I said I'd commit for a year. So after a year, I went home. Well, I think I had a break. I might not have gone back to my mother's home, but I had some time away and came back. I said, yep, I'll commit again. And I did that 3 times. The end of the third time, the abbot said to me, well, what do you want to do this year? And he said, give me an answer within a week. And I was in a much better space, to be honest. Um, I'll bring it down. So this is my journal from that time. Yeah. But where is it? It might be. You can kind of see this was me writing. There's just how much anger and it just says hate, hate, die. Um, you know, I'm dying in pain. It devours me. And just talk about that. So I wrote journals upon journals. So this all eased away, and I'm just in a much better place. I'm still not well physically, still had chronic fatigue, but mentally I was in a much better space. So the abbot said to me, do you want to stay or go? And at the end of the week, I literally didn't have an answer. I didn't know. I said, if you need an answer now, it's going to be a no. It's going to be, I'm going to leave because I didn't know. I thought I could stay, but because of my health, it was like, actually, maybe I need to do something to help. I need to start eating after midday. I need to start properly exercising again. And it's been really difficult, to be honest. And I loved being, do I love to? It was life transformational. And so I just said, okay, I'm going to go. And I didn't know what to do, but I lived under, and when I left, I lived under the table of a friend's. He put a mattress out, and I was under his table for a few weeks, and I think then eventually I went back to work to live at my mother's house, and I spent a few months there, and I had a bit of savings. My sister had given me some money because I'd spent it all in the monastery, and I ended up for a year. I started to do psychotherapy again, and I started to paint. So I'd really got into painting. That was one of the ways I'd really healed in the monastery, was through the painting, through my Jungian analyst. She got me into painting. So I had a studio, I was painting. And then after a year, I run out of money. And I really didn't want to go back to the corporate world. I'd always vowed in leaving in 2000, never again, but needed money. And I got working in a corporation, another Fortune 500 corporation. But they were lovely people there. And I started to share my story. So, I've just come out of a monastery, and they're like, really fascinating. And then they asked me if I teach meditation and stress management. And so I started to run a class. I set up a website, and that was 2006. And I've been doing that ever since, part-time, and I now do this full-time. So my work now is, last 10 years have been working with ex-boarders, leaders, executives, because many of the leaders and executives have been to boarding school. So that's what I've been doing now since 2000, nearly 20 years. Teaching that, and I've been doing videos on YouTube since about 2006, I think, 2000, no, 2007, and teaching meditation, things like that. And yeah, it's been quite a journey. It's a lot of the time I've done this work part time, and the rest of the time I worked looking after animals, cleaning up animal poo, and digging trenches, laboring. Um, it was really useful to have that humility. I think partly leaving the monastery, I thought I am someone, and actually I needed to be humble and go, no, I'm no one. I've just been through this experience. This is my personal experience, but that was really useful. I also spent a lot of time working with children, and because of that kind of almost deep inner child work that I did in the monastery, getting into painting and writing, and I got into working as a forest school teacher, worked with children in care, doing one-to-one, support work, and yeah, really loved that work. And then eventually, my my one-to-one coaching work got so busy that I just needed to drop everything else and just focus on, and now, I do my podcast. I've got this documentary, Boarding on Insanity, which is coming out probably March time this year. And, that's exploring my boarding school journey, but then also asking that greater question. If so many of our leaders have been to these schools, and it's a trauma, which that's what I'm suggesting, you know, how does that impact their decision making? And it's just fascinating as soon as you realize that, oh my God, Tony Blair, he went, not only did he go to boarding school, but he was beaten so badly that he ran away. He didn't, not only ran away from boarding school, but he tried to leave the country, get on a plane and leave. Boris Johnson, the only time he's serious, according to Conrad Black, is talking about corporal punishment. He hates it because he was beaten at boarding school, at prep school. And we realized that, oh, maybe the cover up that we see today, it's linked in. Justin Welby, he was at boarding school from age 8. There was a well-known paedophile working at the school all the time he was a child. What did the school do with it? Nothing. Just hidden. It's just we live in this society which covers things up. That's what we do. It's always duty of care to the institution rather than to the people. And I think that's what's really going to unfold this year is there's going to be a flip. Actually, it's people are important now. They have to come first. We're not going to listen to the institutions that the institution's more important than a person. It's not. And yeah, so that's kind of, and I'm very passionate about this because most people don't even think, why is it that politicians don't seem to care about the vulnerable? And when you look at it on a psychological level, Peter Levine in his work, Waking the Tiger, he says the man who was hit as a child will feel compelled to hit as an adult. Therefore, you could take that out and you put the man who was told vulnerability was bad is going to hate the vulnerable in society. It's like you realize, oh my God, why is society like this? Is it because our leaders are traumatized? And I'll put a thing in here that not everyone is negatively impacted by boarding school. I totally admit that. Some people, it's really great for them. But it's a very small number. Again, I've got these 50 biographies. I think there's only one or two who doesn't have a story of extreme abuse or neglect. I bought Freddie Mercury's book, who was a boarder from 8 to 16 in India. He only went home once a year. He said the food was awful. And the writer was saying they think that's why he really struggled with food for the rest of his life. You just realize, oh my God, this is not just one story. This is over and over and over and over again.
You've mentioned there so many people at the top of politics, business, the arts, etc., have this sort of a background, probably disproportionate to the population, more broadly speaking. I wonder if you might list a few more names to give a sense of that. And also, just to pick up on one thing you said, I'm very curious. Why it is you think this year there's going to be some sort of a flip? What makes you think that there'll be a societal flip on something as deep as this sort of instinct of don't explain, don't complain?
I think, how many times over the last year has a cover-up come to the surface? I think maybe this is the fifth one with the grooming gangs. We're looking at the fifth or the sixth. We've got post office, the blood scandal. We've got child sexual abuse, ICSA. There's probably others out there. I've said the post office, but there's quite a few which we're just Justin Welby, and now we've got the grooming gangs. It's almost like it's enough. People are starting to speak up. People are starting to wake up and go, no, enough. And I was just thinking that, it's like people are really getting behind Reform UK. But as I look at most of the leaders in Reform UK, Richard Tice, some of the other leaders, they're all boarders. That, for me, we really need someone from the working classes, someone to represent the people to be a leader. And unfortunately, it's very difficult for them to get into power, to have a voice. But I see that starting to change now. I really do. And again, for me, this is my vision. Whether it happen, I don't know. But I really feel there is awakening happening. We've had enough. I think Britain is an amazing place, and it's the people which make it amazing. But at the top, we have people who, in my opinion, are traumatized. They wouldn't do these things. They wouldn't cover up again and again and again. Let young girls be and just, oh, we're not going to investigate. What? What country do we live in? So I feel that there is a shift going on there. I've forgotten your second question, Steve.
It was some names as you peruse your shelf of 50 biographies. You've done quite a bit of research into this. What are some names from arts, business, politics?
So he used to snore, King Charles, and so he was beaten on the head. And he says, I hardly get any sleep. It's absolute hell. Stephen Fry, he has a story in here of he broke his arm when he was at boarding school, falling off a seesaw. And at the same time, his brother broke his arm playing rugby. And so Stephen was seen as the idiot. Oh, you broke your arm just falling off a thing. You know, you could have done it playing for rugby. Turns out his brother didn't break his arm playing rugby. He was thrown by a school porter into some steps, and it broke his arm. Ranulph Fiennes here, he basically contemplated suicide because he was attractive at Eton, and so the older boys would chase him around, try to bed him. Gabriel Byrne, it was more of a spiritual seminary, and he was sexually abused. Who else have we got here? Roald Dahl. He was beaten. He had a pretty horrific time. Harry as well. I mean, other ones, JFK, he went, Princess Diana. You obviously got Charles Spencer. He was sexually abused at boarding school. You've got Richard Beard in his book, Sad Little Men. He talks about it. Which other ones have we got? Aldous Huxley, Jeremy Paxman. Elon Musk was out to boarding school, but he didn't board. But he was thrown down the stairs and hospitalized for 2 weeks and beaten up. Minnie Driver, she went age 6, I think. She says, deciding to go to boarding school was one of the top 3 worst mistakes of my life. So, yeah, I probably got other ones here. Prince Harry, obviously. I mean, he didn't have too bad a time, to be honest, on the surface. But the neglect he talks about, he had one matron who he could go and speak to for 50 boys. So maybe he would see her once a week or something like that. So, yeah, it's just lots of different stories. Eddie Izzard, he went age 6. Said the food was terrible. Catherine, Princess Catherine, Princess of Wales, the current one. So she was sent to as a day pupil age 13 to Down House. And because she was very pretty and tall, the girls really hated her and kind of just teased her and bullied her. And it was so bad that she got stress eczema on her skin, and her parents pulled her out after 2 terms and sent her to another boarding school. So yeah, there's literally dozens of these stories. Will Carling, the rugby captain, he went age 6 again. So yeah, it's there's lots of people, and I have a database of about 250 names of some of the most powerful people in business. Christiane Amanpour of CNN. She was an ex-boarder. I think the editor of CNN or the CEO of CNN, ex-boarder. Rupert Murdoch, he's an ex-boarder. So you've just got all of these people who are very powerful positions, went to these schools. The head of the FBI, who's just resigned, he was an ex-boarder. So it's like, oh, right, okay. There's a common theme here.
And you've interviewed some of these names, Charles Spencer, for example, Princess Diana's brother. That was quite a harrowing and moving interview, in fact, on your channel, which of course I'll link in the show notes to this, to Piers' channel. You interview boarding school survivors, as you call them, as well as mental health practitioners of various types, psychologists, psychiatrists, and so on. Yes, it's quite remarkable indeed. I wonder that last sort of biographical question, really, as we start coming towards the end here. I think sometimes in telling a story, naturally, one sticks to what's worked. The pathway of one thing led to another to another. Did you have any dead ends? Did you go into theories, ideas, practices, and so on that you got into for a bit and then sort of abandoned and didn't find particularly helpful? I wonder if there are any like that you've pruned, I suppose, particularly I suppose post monastery when you're on your own and orienting yourself. I know you taught
All the
meditation. I know you advocated, for example, law of attraction, Abraham Hicks' secret, that sort of stuff. So I'm wondering what sort of at that time of exploration, what you were looking at, and what have you pruned, what have you kept?
all the time, as in, I'm always finding things, of pruning away or of trying things out. And I've tried so many avenues which have not worked. And I think that for me is, I have a daily practice of about 3 hours in the morning and about half an hour in the evening. I'll probably do another half hour's reading as well in the evening. So I'd probably do about 4 hours, and I'm always adding things in, pruning things out. And I would say that, yeah, there's certain things which I think that there's a Native American phrase that does something grow corn? If you plant it, is it going to grow some fruit or a seed of a kernel? And it's like try a practice out, do it for 3 months on a daily basis. If it doesn't work at the end of the 3 months, just let it go. So I think I've tried lots of things. Some things are in the bank. So it's like, okay, like Qigong. I love Qigong. I'm currently doing a Taoist practitioner, sexual teachings. So becoming a practitioner trainer in that. So I've been doing that for 4 or 5 months now.
Oh, who's that with?
With Shashi Saluna and Minka DeVos, who are Taoist practitioners. So it's obviously that's her book for women. She's not written one for men yet. So they're called the Tao Tantric Arts. Um, so I've been doing that, and yeah, so I have my Qigong practice. So I've not done Falun Gong for a while, but I might then pick it up. And then I have my central core practices, which is meditation, which is matrix re-imprinting, which is breath work, which is yoga on a daily, some form of cardio, running, biking, some form of weights. Um, you know, Sometimes I'll do cold water therapy, my most resistant one. It's good for me, but I don't like it. So yeah, there's lots of practices, and I'd say that if someone's thinking about beginning a practice, just begin, give it 3 months. Don't make a decision, and then at the end of the 3 months, say, "Oh yeah, does that work for me or not?" And I say to my clients, it's like I ask them to commit to at least 15 minutes, 30 minutes a day of daily practice. I do my 3 hours because, well, one, I want to try these different things out that I'm teaching them. And if I don't do it, well, how can I teach you what to do? Other things I do is I journal, I create, so I'll do some guitar, I meditate. I've said, you know, connect with my wife. So yeah, I've got these different routines and practices that I'll do. I'll go and sit barefoot in the garden, do a sit spot, so like a little meditation, do some breathing. Um, so yeah, yeah. So all the time I prune things or I try things out and I go, does that work for me? Do I feel any change? And I'm like, no, it doesn't work for me. Doesn't mean it doesn't work for someone else. Um, so that's what I try and what teach my clients is this works for me. You know, the EFT, that's been transformative. So I've used that since 2000 is when I first learned it. Main practice I use with my clients because it just works like that. It's magic.
What techniques are you using in your meditation practice?
I mainly focus on the Four Noble Truths. So I will sit and say if I got something bubbling which is unpleasant, I'll just go, there's suffering, dukkha. Second one, I'll just go, if it's something I'm craving or something I'm trying to push away, I just do the second one, tanha in Pali, that there's craving. So just noticing. And then the third one is, the third noble truth, there is an end to this suffering, or this end to this, suffering. So it's like, this is the way it is. Everything that arises ceases. On Kondana in the deer park when the Buddha speaks to him. And it's like, yeah, that's one of the practices. Another one is the sound of silence. So just listening to the buzzing sound of silence, and I'll just sit and I'll meditate with that. And gratitude as well, I like to use. And then also just the body, physical sensations. And those are the main ones that I'll sit with.
Very interesting. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much, Piers. I wonder now, as we bring it to an end, if you have any closing remarks you'd like to make. Also, of course, all your details I will include in the show notes below, and you have a very fascinating, although at times confronting and harrowing podcast, but very, very worthwhile indeed. And that's, of course, linked below. And you have your documentary, which at the time of this recording is coming out, or is not yet out, but in the future, if you're listening to this in 2020 whatever, or 2030 whatever, it's probably out by now. So that's there as well. So anything you'd like to mention in that regard, but also any closing remarks?
Yeah, so bless you, Steve, for being such a great listener. Thank you. Really appreciate that. And thank you to the people who are listening. Really appreciate you for taking the time to listen. And if you've been to boarding school or had some form of trauma, then the invitation would be to find someone. Find either a group. There's many groups. There's a client of mine who set up an organization called Seen and Heard with a few others. And they do regular groups once a week, a couple of times a week, where you can go as an ex-boarder and you can just meet in circle virtually. So I would say get support. You don't have to do it on your own. It's an illusion that we learnt at boarding school that you have to do it all on your own. That's not true. That's, like I found in the monastery, is you've got to do it in community. Our trauma began in a group, and therefore we can heal in a group, whether that is a therapist, a coach, get support. And also read. I love reading, but my invitation would be, read Nick's book, which is this one here. If you went to boarding school, The Making of Them, and if you want to understand more about the effect of boarding school on the world, is Wounded Leaders, also by Nick Duffel. And that will just give you an insight into, what's actually the impact of having these wounded leaders in charge. And it's a huge impact, to be honest. And so bless you, and keep going. That's, I wrote a song a few years ago, just keep going, and then some. So, that's me.
Piers Cross, thank you very much.
Blair.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.